Hi, Dan Stein here, president of FAIR. Do taxpayers have to foot the bill for immigrants the minute they walk across the border? Do they have the right to use welfare and other benefits if they want the right to live in the United States, the greatest country on earth? Hi, we're joined today by Heather Ham-Warren, who's a senior government relations manager. And those of you know Hart J. Holman, well, you know, he can't do his work without the great work that Heather does. And she's one of the big brains behind the operation, extraordinarily effective. And she's going to help me and you drill down on this whole question of what's called the public charge bar. Basically a core principle of American immigration law going back almost to the beginning that says hardworking, want to contribute, got a lot of unique skills and ability, you ought to get a shot maybe to come on in. But if you're just going to come in here and immediately go on welfare and you need public assistance and that sort of thing, how many millions and millions of dollars should taxpayers pay for the privilege, if you will, bringing in mostly low skill and poorly educated labor? So Congress, of course, has been grappling with this issue. It's been part of the law for 100-some years, most of the 20th century. President Trump has come forward with an important proposal. And the good news is that three courts which had issued these nationwide injunctions, which particularly in the Southern District of New York, there was a crazy injunction that just said, wow, immigrants ought to be able to come and live the American dream. And immediately, of course, they need to get on welfare because after all, getting on welfare is part of the American dream. And it was a crazy political injunction and it was upheld by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Well, the good news is last week, Supreme Court stayed that injunction, that third injunction. So now this new regulation is able to go into effect. So I've got my iPad here and I'm going to be looking for your comments and questions. This is really an important issue and a lot of misunderstanding about what the history of it is. And so first, Heather's going to take us a little bit through some of the background and the early part. And of course, we're happy to answer your questions, post them in. I will take a look at them as I am able. And you've always been so sweet about commenting on our great work, and I appreciate that. But you can also ask good questions about the public charge bar or any other question that you have about immigration policy. Immigration, the other I word, okay? Maybe now that impeachment is wrapping up, we can get to it, right? So, Heather, what's the background on the public charge bar?
Yes, Dan, thank you so much for having me here. As Dan was saying, this is not a new concept. Public charge is something that is first brought to our attention in the colonial Massachusetts statutes. Even in the colonies, they didn't want people coming over who were going to be a public charge or a burden onto the government and the resources that they had in a limited capacity.
Even in liberal Massachusetts?
Even in liberal Massachusetts.
Was Massachusetts liberal in 1675?
I'm sure they were, less liberal, but probably still had their leanings. The first federal statute which addresses public charge occurred in 1882. That was actually the first federal immigration statute. And at the time, it said that there was a compelling federal government interest for people to be coming over who were not going to become a burden to their neighbors. And specifically, those were more public houses where people were coming, straight from Europe and being put into these public homes.
Well, see, look, in 1885, we didn't have the great welfare state, right?
Correct.
We didn't have the New Deal. We hadn't had, that was in the 30s, 1930s. We didn't have the Great Society from the 60s. There really weren't a lot of public welfare programs. If people needed assistance, it usually fell on the churches or private charity groups, that kind of thing, right? So why do you think
Correct.
Congress felt that they ought to pass a bar in 1885? Any idea?
Yeah, I think just at the time, resources were so scarce and they were trying to really strengthen their government. They were at a time of relative peace within themselves and with other countries, and they were looking for a way to strengthen their own economy, which is, interestingly, what we're trying to do here today. But the next time after the 1800s when public charge came in was in the mid-90s under the Clinton administration. And there was actually a bipartisan proposal in Congress, which would be unheard of these days, unfortunately, which essentially reiterated that 1880 stance that there was a compelling federal interest for public charge bars to be in place. And at the time, public charge was not defined in the statute. They were just using the common law term that had been utilized for centuries at that point. So the Clinton administration chose to narrowly tailor it and utilize only cash benefits such as SSI or TANF.
So basically the Clinton administration turned around and narrowed it
Yes.
from what had been prior to that, and certainly up through at least the 70s, a pretty broad interpretation that if you worked for the State Department, you worked for a consular office overseas, if you didn't think somebody had the ability to make a living, no green card, no visa, no reason to come in, right? And it was during the 1990s that the Clinton administration passed these new regulations that said, no, 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 you can go on most forms of welfare and we're going to restrict it to just a couple of areas, right?
Yes.
SSI,
Cash
Social Security,
benefits,
and
correct.
cash benefits, which meant that the vast majority of welfare benefits, particularly state and local school lunch programs, all those kinds of things would be fine.
Yes.
And so over time, we've seen what? I mean, the skill level of immigrants has gone down.
Yes.
The welfare dependency rates have gone up. And if you correct for age, I mean, even though we have older Americans who are on Social Security, what have you, but if you correct for age, immigrants are just as likely or more likely to use welfare benefits as similarly aged natives.
Yes, actually, in fact, a study from the Center for Immigration Studies that was put out in the last couple years says that Americans, American-born citizens, typically in their lifetime, 30% will utilize some sort of public assistance program, whereas immigrant-led households, typically 60 to 75% will utilize these benefit programs in their lifetime.
So FAIR has said for years, and the Trump administration agreed with FAIR, that why should Americans support an immigration program if you're bringing in millions of people who want to immediately go on welfare, who are illiterate in any language, have a fifth grade education, and basically their value added productively doesn't allow them to earn enough to stay above the social safety net. And therefore, we need to go back and take a look at the public charge bar, right? So what did the Trump administration decide to do?
Yeah, so in 2018, the Trump administration announced a proposed rule to expand public charge bar definition. Under this definition, it's still relatively narrow. Things like free and reduced school lunch will not be taken into effect, CHIP will not be taken into effect, WIC, the things that really aim towards the most sort of vulnerable of our society.
Yeah, people who are, for situations that they themselves could not have
Absolutely.
been responsible for.
And it's also worth noting that it's not applicable to asylees, refugees, children who are being adopted from other countries, victims of domestic violence. So there's still very broad categories that the Trump administration is protecting and not putting this public charge bar towards. But in 2018, the proposed rule came out. The government received, I believe, 250,000 notice and comments during the notice and comment period, including hundreds from FAIR supporters. We actually put it on our website.
A lot of you out there, hundreds of you put public comments in support of the public charge regulations, and we appreciate that.
Yeah, it was really amazing. We were really impressed with the turnout from our supporters. And then the final rule was released in August of last year. Immediately, they were hit with several lawsuits from a handful of states and a few open borders groups. And then those were the
why
injunctions came in.
why would states want their welfare programs to go to immigrants? Why?
You know, I'm not really sure. I think that what it comes down to is the state welfare programs believe that they might have to take on more of a burden if they're still choosing to utilize these people and they're not able to access these federal resources. But the other issue could just be they're responding to the loud outcry from the small populations that are upset about it.
Well, Beth Reynolds says we have our own homeless veterans and seniors to take care of. Why do we want to bring in people who need the same assistance?
Yeah, and that seems to be the general consensus. It really does seem to be pretty common sense. There hasn't been a lot of outcry from members of Congress. Like you mentioned, there's another I word going on that's taking up a lot of bandwidth. But in terms of pushback for Trump administration's immigration policies, it's been a lot quieter than a lot of the other things that have come out.
Okay, so the administration faced several court injunctions.
Yes.
And this has gone on since 2018.
Yeah.
And now the Supreme Court has acted. You want to talk about what the Supreme Court finally decided last week?
Yeah, so I believe three of the four injunctions were overturned, lifted on appeal.
And basically the administration was persistent, okay? The point is, unlike a lot of previous administrations, when they were faced with these injunctions, Sadly for the ACLU and some of these Democratic states that sued, this administration does not give up. This administration doesn't throw in the towel, capitulate, but instead they fought all the way to the Supreme Court and...
Yes, and the Supreme Court ruled that the public charge bar is permitted to continue at this time as the case continues through the courts. So this is not the end-all be-all. Obviously, both sides are not going to stop fighting. The open borders groups, the states, are going to continue, and like you mentioned, the Trump administration is going to remain really vigilant. It's especially important that this was something that was, put out at sort of the beginning of the Trump presidency. We're coming towards the end of his first term, so it can be very important. Nobody knows what's going to happen in November, and it's important to make sure that everyone's following through on their promises.
So you ought to read the regulation if you haven't seen it. Bernie Sanders doesn't, well, first of all, Milton Friedman agreed with Barack Obama. Barack Obama, they all understood that you can't have national health care and open borders. If you have no border controls and national health care, the result is national bankruptcy, right? You can't have a national welfare program if you don't have effective border control. Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, what's his take on national health care and immigration?
Right, well, one of his big platforms is that if anybody who's here, everybody's welcome to come here and everybody's welcome to get free health care.
So how does that change the finances? We hear, well, immigration is such a positive benefit, and we're not going to take anything away from hardworking immigrants who come and contribute mightily. There's no question that there are people who do that. But the point is, in the aggregate, if you have a tremendous amount of low-skill, poor immigration coming into the country, and you have these very expensive entitlement programs and a national debt somewhere around $20 trillion, with an annual debt nationally approaching $1 trillion, what does that do to the future of the country's economy?
Yeah, it's not looking bright.
Not looking bright. So the public charge bar is extremely important. And a lot of people would say, isn't this just basic common sense? If you want to have a public that supports the idea of immigration, if you want to have a broad consensus that immigration can actually help the country, you won't bring in workers who compete with American workers in an unfair way through guest worker programs, for example, or illegal immigration. And B, you won't have programs that are essentially a form of labor subsidy. If an employer is hiring cheap labor from foreign countries, it's only cheap to the employer, because what the public charge bar shows, what the undercutting of the wage shows, is that the employer is privatizing the profits of the lower wage labor, but commonizing the costs onto the community, right? Credit Trump administration for trying to hold the line on this.
Yeah, and what you mentioned, the aggregate is really an important word here, because there's not a certain dollar value that individuals have to have. It is a totality of circumstances. The Trump administration will be taking into account their age, their family status, of course their financial status, but as well as their education and their skills. So you don't necessarily have to be a poor college student graduating and think, oh, there's no chance that I can immigrate into the United States. Absolutely not. If you have the skills and the education and or the family or financial resources, it really is an all-encompassing process. It's not as black and white as some advocates would like you to believe.
But if we did enforce a law, if the State Department did enforce a bar that said if you don't have any way of making a living, you can't come in, what would that do to the level of immigration on balance?
Yeah, that's hard. I don't know if that's something I can answer. Maybe a little too what if
Probably
for
won't
me.
Increase it.
Right.
It might decrease it, right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, well, that's speculative, but the point is if you required immigrants to have the education and the skill levels that they need to truly compete, maybe 30% of today's immigration flow would not be admitted. So we would assume the Democrats in Congress are not content with this, right? So is there any movement in the House to try to introduce a bill to undo the public charge regulations?
There were a couple bills very kind of quickly turned around, maybe not as thoroughly thought out bills that were teased and introduced in 2018. It's been very minimal talk about it since then. Even with the Supreme Court's decision on Monday, we've been on the Hill all week. Nobody even really wants to talk about it.
So who else is helping defend the administration's public charge bar? Any other organizations you're aware of helping to defend it?
As I'm sure there are other like-minded groups, but as far as I know, we're really the ones that are digging in the hardest.
Well, what was so gratifying was to see that the Second Circuit, even though it upheld this injunction, Neil Gorsuch, in the Supreme Court decision overturning it and staying the injunction, observed that this whole nationwide injunction business that we've seen, nationwide injunctions were not part of the judiciary for most of the 20th century. And all of a sudden, there's been this skyrocketing increase in nationwide injunctions during the Trump administration.
Yes.
No doubt from political judges, many of whom were appointed by either Clinton or Obama. And they've been doing this as a form of political delay. I mean, you cannot read the original district court decision in New York, in the Southern District of New York, and joining the public charge bar and not see the judge who is applying his own political point of view and not interpreting the law and the facts. And this nationwide injunction problem, Neil Gorsuch observed, is something that the Supreme Court and the Judicial Conference need to be thinking about reining in, because the bald-faced politicization of the judiciary is undermining public confidence. Okay, the Trump administration has had a lot of appointments they've made to the judiciary.
Yes.
They are changing dramatically the makeup of the Ninth Circuit. And probably the President Trump's, if he were impeached tomorrow and removed from office, his greatest contribution politically would be his impact on the judiciary, particularly on district court judicial appointments. So is there anything more to be added? Do we need to remain vigilant in defending what has happened here? Because there's going to be a Supreme Court decision case eventually again, right, as it continues to work.
Yes, it'll
This could go
continue
on
to work its
into the
way
second
up.
term.
Yes. Well,
Unless we have a Bernie and he'll sign an executive order getting rid of it immediately, right?
Yeah, that's important. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the actual term public charge is not defined in a statute. So the Clinton administration defined it, the Trump administration is now redefining it. So no matter what is said, a different administration could choose again to redefine it. It's really up to Congress if they don't like the way that the administration is doing it. Of course, immigration-related legislation is not, fast tracking through Congress anytime in the near future.
Nothing is.
Yeah, nothing is. But
They did get a trade agreement.
especially immigration-related issues. So we are going to keep up with it, obviously. We're going to keep putting it out in our weekly newsletters. It's been moving pretty quickly in terms of judicial issues, but, the Supreme Court still hasn't even ruled on DACA, and that was, handed out 3-4 years ago at this point. So we have some time, definitely, to see what's going to happen in the future with public charge.
Well, Bonnie Kahns writes, the American people paid into Social Security and all the taxes we pay that get taken out of our paychecks to give it to people who come here for free is hurting all of us. You're so right, Bonnie. And if you go back and look at Massachusetts in 1675, and you take a look at the first federal regulations on public charge in the 1880s, you realize that the federal government was simply making good on a commitment they made to the states, which really had control of this issue before the Civil War, to essentially say, we're going to protect you, the taxpayers, from the incursion of people into your state, into your country, who do not have that ability to take care of themselves, so they don't simply fall on the community and taxpayers. That whole equation has been turned on its head slowly through the 1970s and 80s, and then ultimately bigly in the Clinton administration. And without any real public discussion and comment, they emasculated the public charge bar to say that it was almost impossible to deport an alien who is coming in and getting on welfare. Americans will support the idea of immigration. They love the story of immigration, but they're only going to support it if they feel like it's actually serving our national interest, the people's interest. Here at FAIR, you can count on the defense of those core principles here in the public, here in Congress, here among policymakers, and engaging Americans all across the country just like you. So I want to thank you for joining in. I want to thank Heather for joining me on this Facebook Live. We'll be back with another one in a few days on different topics to keep you informed about the immigration issue. So we will see you soon. Thanks.